Kindly start, sir.
Your poster is still there.
Sir, kindly start.
Hello and welcome to another India's Neighbourhood First policy program. The focus of this program is on Nepal, a post-OLI and post-US grant of the MCC development program. In other words, passage of the MCC grant as well as after OLI. How this shift in domestic and foreign policy will impact on the almost eternal triangular India-China-Nepal relationship, and one might add now, add US to this triangular relationship after the passage of MCC, our panelists will try to explain. We have a great panel. Our panelists consist of Kanak Mani Dikshit. Kanak Mani Dikshit is a Nepali author and journalist and used to edit the Himal magazine. The second panelist is Amish Raj Mulmi. Amish is a Nepali journalist also, but more importantly, an author of almost best-selling book, All Roads Lead North, Nepal Turns to China. Ambassador Ranjit Ray, he is also an author besides being an ambassador to Nepal. Ranjit Ray has written a book called The Kathmandu Dilemma, and he was an ambassador in Nepal at a very critical time when relations between Nepal and India were on the downswing. Nihar Nayak is our fourth panelist. Nihar Nayak is a research fellow. He's a doctorate. He's a doctor, Nihar Nayak. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis and has written extensively on Nepal. That's a great panel, you will agree. And also, we have another Nepali journalist and a researcher who lives now in India for the time being. She is Akanksha Shah. Akanksha Shah will join us later after our regular program. The format for this program is going to be in the following manner. Q&A with the panelists. I will be asking the questions and my panelists will answer those questions. That bit of the program will run for about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A by the audience, normally 15 to 20 minutes. We normally wrap up this program in about 60 minutes, but since we've started late today by 5 to 7 minutes, we will apparently and obviously extend the time. I urge the audience, those of you who are watching this program, to kindly put your questions in the chat box so that we are able to address these questions. Now, my first question is for Kanak Mani Dikshit. And Kanak, the question goes, how do you, Kanak, picture Nepal after 3 years of OLI rule and his fall due to serious issues of power sharing and his authoritarian rule among the COVID pandemic? So the question is, what has changed in post-Oli Nepal? Kanak Dikshit, Kanak, over to you.
Thank you, General Mehta. Going to your question by way of referring to the title of our program, Post-Oli Era and the Post-MCC Era, I would suggest that we are very much in the start of the MCC era. MCC, of course, is a project, $500 million grant project, which was objected to by the Chinese. We'll come to that later. And it is certainly not the post-Oli era. Oli is very much a player in Nepali politics. He's out of power now due to the power politics of Nepal. Neither would I title his time in office as authoritarian if we know the terminology of authoritarian, and which refers to the fundamental freedoms of any society, whether we are able to enjoy them. So in that sense, I would differ slightly with the tone and tenor of the question, but I would say very important indeed to talk about, so where are we now vis-a-vis bilateral and trilateral relationships? And you mentioned in the beginning.
Kanak,
Yes.
sorry for interrupting you. I want to deal only at this moment with the question of what has changed. In other words, the post-Oli era, the Sher Bahadur Deopa government since 13th July. I am leaving MCC for the panelists and the triangular relationship to a different part of the question.
Okay,
So
then
confine yourself to that specific portion of the question.
thank you, General. I'll address your question directly and not go wayward in any way. What Nepal has seen is a change in government, not a change in regime. So from what from the outside may seem as extreme political upheavals, Nepali society as a whole has seen the ouster of Mr. Oli and the incoming of Sher Bahadur Deoba. Other than that, I don't see anything that has gone amiss in terms of what the state and the government and the people should be doing under the new constitution. For example, we need to stay the course in the new constitution of Nepal, which is, forget about foreign policy for now, but we must stay the course on the primary elements of the new constitution. Are they being followed? Yes. Are we going in for local elections as planned, late April? Yes. Are we going in for general elections 5 years after the last general elections? Yes. So I would offer to you that Nepal, while the politics is very unstable, the state is stable. That is how I see it, General.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kanak. The next question is for Amish Mulmi. And the question goes like this, that Sanjay Jha, in his book, Backfire in Nepal, has said that, talked about how India lost the plot in Nepal. Now in your, and he adds somewhere in 2020. Now in your book too, All Roads Lead North, you too mention, in fact, your conclusion is how Nepal turned north. In other words, India lost the plot. Do you agree with that formulation? And if not, why not? And if yes, kindly elucidate. Amish?
Yeah, thank you, General Mehta. I think it's, I wouldn't say, see, when you're saying lost the plot, I mean, you have to speak about it in relative terms, right? Like, I mean, did India lose?
Amish, I'm not saying that. Sanjay Jha in his book, Backfire.
So, yeah. So, I mean, see, ultimately, it's a relative question, right? Did India lose its influence because of 2015 and what happened post the constitution? Obviously, it did. Did China gain influence in the country? Yes, it did. So in that scale, obviously, you can argue that yes, India did have a sort of a negative fallout after the 2015 constitution. Whether that fallout can still be sort of like questioned in terms of, has India stayed the course? Has India changed its course in Kathmandu? Has there been any change in Indian policy? That remains to be seen. Of course, India has focused a lot more on connectivity since then. It seems to be making a conscious effort to remove itself from the day-to-day politics. There is a sort of, in the entire MCC debate, we did not hear anything from India on any lines. So there seems to be a conscious effort on part of Delhi to step back from the politics of Nepal and instead focus on connectivity. Now, whether that results in a gain in influence at pre-2015 levels, that is still yet to be seen, I would say.
Right. And would you say that during the Oli era, the relations between India and Nepal, were they stable? Were they, in comparison with what was happening with Nepal-China relations during the Oli era?
See, of course, I mean, India and Nepal relations reached a new low simply because India issued a new political map, Nepal issued a new political map in response. So obviously there is an entire territorial dispute that is ongoing at the moment, right? And because the map was issued while Oli was the prime minister, that sense is always there that, all right, because of Oli, relations went down. But I would ask to look at this in a greater nuance of how relations were with China at the time as well. The NCP was formed. We know that there was sort of Chinese encouragement for the NCP to be formed. We know they still prefer the communists to be in power in Nepal. But having said that, while Oli was in power, there were internal dissents that was happening within the party that sort of strained his take on foreign policy as well. You could see that he was not very happy with the Chinese sort of encouragement about keeping the party together, while Prachanda and Madhav Kumar Nepal were sort of, forcing him to take, the dispute was ongoing, right? And so I think that there were lots of dynamics happening at that time. So you could not exactly, I would argue, and beyond that, the pandemic had also started, the borders had closed down. There were these issues about students had to be returned and whether the borders would open. The traders had started complaining under the Oli government as well. The border dispute was first revealed in Humla, was revealed first under the Oli government. So these issues are obviously there. So I would not assess it by saying that the Oli era, the 2.5 years, nearly 3 years of Oli was a pro-China and an anti-India government. It had its own dynamics. A lot of them were dependent on internal party dynamics. And that was one of the fallouts, that our foreign policy seemed to be affected by internal domestic politics, which should not have happened.
Right. Thank you for that. Ambassador Ranjit Ray, my question for you is, and it's a follow-up from what Amish Mulme has just said about the Oli tenure, that when Oli began mending fences with India and vice versa, you wrote some articles at that time which were highly critical of India doing so. And you used, if I recall correctly, the equivalent of that this was immoral. Do you stick by what you wrote then? And or was this, as many Indians say, a very deft policy move by India to mend relations with Oli? Ambassador?
I don't think I've ever used the term immoral. I think in politics, you can't really use such value-loaded terms. It's all about interests. Now, I think during the Oli era, I think our relations did sink to a new low. And as Amish has said, Nepalese foreign policy was really determined by domestic politics. And I think in order to ward off the pressures from Prachand and Madhav Nepal, Oli possibly thought that the boundary issue is a lifesaver. And so this became a huge, big issue. And, this boundary issue is going to really bedevil the relationship in the future, just like the 1950 treaty. It will be one of those intractable problems that will go on and on. Having said that, India has to deal with whichever government is in power in Nepal. And, there was a long hiatus in the bilateral exchanges with Nepal. And I think that was leading to concerns in both countries. We have a lot of important projects. If India steps back, then, we don't know who's going to come in place. So I think it was important to have a rapprochement, begin, talking to whichever government that is in power. And, that's something, whether we like a government or not is immaterial. We have to deal with whichever government is in power. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, we ignore, the measures or what that government has done vis-a-vis India, let alone, how Oli interpreted the Nepalese constitution during his tenure. That's a matter really for the Nepalese people to decide. But, there were so many other incidents vis-a-vis India that Oli had raised, including, strange statements about Ayodhya and so on. So I think the relationship, it kind of swung like a pendulum, and till domestic circumstances brought about a change in Nepal.
Thank you for that, Ambassador Ranjit. Nihar, the question for you is a follow-up of what the Ranjit Ray has said. The Supreme Court of Nepal terminated for the second time the Oli government rule. So my question is, how do you assess the performance or the non-performance of the new Dyopa government? That it's a right-left or left-right government with many contradictions, and it's been in power since 13th of July with the opposition UML blocking the parliament with no real business going on, as Mani Dixit said. So what is your assessment of the Dyopa government, the short time it has been in power?
Okay, thank you very much, sir. The question is very much related to what question you asked to Kanak, sir. So one thing I can say that, I don't see any major political changes after Prime Minister Doba took over. The political chaos still continues. The development programs are mostly halted. The constitution crisis partially managed due to coalition partners' compulsion. The template-based foreign policy is still on, and the UML is still emerged as the influential and largest political party even till today, despite there is a NC government in Kathmandu. Economically, Nepali is most of the sectors are in the declining phase, and the realliance between the left parties cannot be ruled out at any point of time. It is very much imminent in future, because again I can say that the Maoist party may split just before the elections. And the one point I'll just add here, that your question related to the Doba's performance, I would like to say Prime Minister Doba is not a prime minister, he's just a prime manager in Nepal. He's just managing the alliances, because he has been so much difficulties. Till date, they have not appointed ambassadors of the many countries. Over 21 countries, ambassador position are still there. Many projects are not improving. And the last, this ordinance on the railway connectivity, Jayanagar and Kurta, that ordinance is just last, that just revived. So the performance of the government is mostly underrated. I don't think it is very satisfactory, and there is a huge governance issue still continues in Nepal.
Thank you for that for that point. Kanak, my question now is that Dr. Nihar Nayak has said, Kanak, that that Sher Bahadur Diopal government is basically a managerial government, but the fact that the passage in Parliament of the once controversial MCC that that brought the left parties on board, and that was opposed at that time, and the vote sailed through, surprising many people after Nepali public had been polarized so much. So isn't this particular management of the vote, the MCC vote, a personal triumph for Diopal?
It is, and it is also a triumph for Nepal, that we do not get so waylaid with conspiratorial geopolitical theories brought up by the extreme left and the royalist right in Nepal to say that a $500 million grant to build transmission lines and some highways will indicate the entry of US imperialism into Nepal. So certainly a success for Mr. Deoba to have managed to push it through, and he has been consistent on MCC since day one. He did not waver. And let me tell you, from behind the curtain, neither did Mr. Oli. And while Mr. Oli was blocking regular work of the parliament, there was actually an unstated understanding with these two leaders of two democratic parties of Nepal. Because I refuse to use the term communist as one bloc in Nepal. There are the Maoists, for God's sakes, and then there is the UML, and then there is the Nepali Congress. The Nepali Congress and the UML, within and outside the parliament, chaperoned this. But the credit does go, as you say, to Mr. Deoba. There is one other credit that Mr. Deoba has for himself, because I will not go into how he manages his party, how he expects to have a coalition government with the one individual and flank of the Maoists and Mr. Pushpa Kamal Dahal. That is the furthest from the Nepali Congress in terms of ideology. How does he plan to manage this in the days ahead? I will not get into that. For now, I will just say that in terms of governance, Mr. Deoba is basically managing relationships and keeping his coalition intact. And this is a coalition with no ideological commitment and very little, in my view, morality. However, his success is MCC, as you said, General Mehta. He has been steadfast. He reached out to Mr. Oli, got Mr. Oli's commitment not to create mayhem in society, because in the end, Mr. Oli had presented it to Parliament, and Mr. Deoba okayed it and pushed it through. But the other one is the two elections that are coming up. Nepal really needs to, and I can't emphasize this enough, for the sake of political stability and geopolitical stability, Nepal needs to stay the course on our constitution, which requires the series of elections to happen on time as mandated by the constitution, because if they don't, things are going to unravel. That is the other success of Mr. Deoba. He is ensuring, he has had trouble with the public also in terms of credibility gap, but in the end, he has ensured local government elections to happen in April. So that is also a feather in his cap. But in terms of governance, as Mr. Nayak says, Mr. Deoba has not had a great success in these last half year and more.
A small additional question, Kanak. Did the impeachment of the Chief Justice Cholendra Rana have anything to do with the vote?
I don't think so. The impeachment, well, he has not been impeached. There is only a motion to impeach that is being discussed. And there is a long distance always in Nepali politics from the plate to the mouth. Long way to go. So I would say no, there are other many murky aspects to Nepali politics that this leads into. The role of the Nepal Bar Association, the role of the Mr. Rana himself. Most importantly, the role of Mr. Pushpa Kamal Dal, whose activism within Nepali politics or his personal brand of opportunistic politics. We should never forget that, and this much I must say because this is what I believe at the core of my heart. If only what you know as Mr. Prachanda, Mr. Pushpa Kamal Dahal, if he were not as Nirnayak, as a player in Nepali politics as much as he is, I will guarantee you that the politics of Mr. Oli, politics of Mr. Deuba, politics of Mr. Madhav Kumar Nepal, all of them would be at a more higher level of political probity than we are now.
So is Prachanda the villain of the piece?
Most of the time.
Right. Amish, following up from this very candid conversation with the Kanak, a question for you, Amish Mulmi, is that following the passage of the MCC, can we infer that the US is back in Nepal with a bang in Nepal? How does this affect China's assumed primacy in Nepal? And does it turn the triangular matrix into a quad, given President Biden's investment of $1.8 billion in the Indo-Pacific to contain China? Your comment?
So, General Mehta, with the first question referring to is the US back in Nepal, I don't think it ever went away. I think that would be I would seriously doubt that would be a misconception to believe that the US was ever away in Nepal. I mean, it had focused a lot more as generally on its development activities, which are not so much, and even the MCC, it has been purporting as a development activity. So, I mean, that is, I don't think it ever went away, right? As to how it affects China, of course, I mean, China, we know that the three statements made by the foreign ministry spokesperson were more than enough to give us a sense of how China perceived the MCC in the country. And beyond that, I think it was also, it has been, it sees the possibility of the MCC being weaponized against China. It sees the possibility of American influence expanding in Nepal and Chinese influence waning because of that, as well as the MCC being a part of this larger American encirclement of China, as you correctly said. But having said that, again, you're saying whether the MCC, the passage of the MCC will translate into an association with the larger Quad, with the larger Indo-Pacific strategy. I doubt it will, at least in the immediate short term, it doesn't seem like that is the sort of the US tactic to, or the US sort of, what the US would like the Quad to do with respect to the MCC in Nepal. I think it is a little bit more nuanced at that, in that the US has, I mean, the MCC's, one of the assistant deputy secretaries of state pretty much said that any project, any grand project that comes to Nepal should benefit Nepal first and not other countries' interests, referring to China. This is back in 2019. So it is pretty much, the US believes the MCC to be one of its sort of weapons to reduce Chinese influence in Nepal. And the passage of the MCC, it had staked a lot on it, which it showed by saying that if the MCC was not passed, larger bilateral relations would get affected. And although the ambassador sort of corrected that and said that wasn't really so, but the fact remains that the passage, the very idea that the $500 million grant could not be passed in a country like Nepal was, I believe it came as a shock to the US, right? Because the fact that, I mean, if you're taking loans from China, a grant would obviously be welcomed with both hands. That's what they had been told. That's what they had perceived. It obviously wasn't so. And so obviously, what the passage of the MCC also revealed was the extent of Chinese political influence in the country and how far it had reached. So, and that was something that I would consider to be a new, let's say, a post-MCC reality as well. So
is it correct then to say that the traditional triangular relationship, Amish Mulmi, is got a fourth portion.
No.
In other words, Duita Dhunga, what Prithvinarayan Shah only talked
Yeah, I
about.
agree. I mean, it's more than, now it's three boulders. Essentially, Nepal is a yam between three boulders. So,
Three boulders.
yeah.
All right. Okay. My follow-up from there, Ambassador Ranjit Ray, what Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, when on his visit to Nepal this week, and in fact, he gave a warning to Nepal, according to one report that I have read about, and in quotes, I say that he said about external interference. Wang Yi is telling his Nepalese counterpart that warning Nepal about external interference, a term usually reserved for India following the ratification of the MCC, and to that he adds that this, in quotes, may threaten core interests of Nepal and China. That is the passage of the MCC. He goes on, Wang Yi, China supports Nepal following an independent domestic and foreign policy. And he added, of course, the usual, that China will support Nepal's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, is there a message besides the United States? I mean, we saw this happen in Sri Lanka, the same war about the MCC, and the Chinese won clearly in Sri Lanka. But do you see in these warnings to Nepal a message not just for Nepal, but for India also?
Well, a couple of points. I think there's been a setback to Chinese diplomacy in Nepal on two occasions. One is when they tried to keep the Communist Party united. That didn't happen. Secondly, they tried to prevent the adoption of MCC. That didn't happen. And, their principal influence in Nepal has really been with the Communist parties. Earlier, apologies to Kanak, but earlier with Prime Minister Oli, and, thereafter with Prachanda and Madhav Kumar Nepal. So, these have been the key players, who were responsive to Chinese influence in Nepal. And some of the comments that Wang Yi made, I think some of them are really gratuitous. And if you ask me, somewhat patronizing. And, I think, I don't know whether it's a warning or not, but I think basically Wang Yi probably came to test the waters and to see, what the mood of the country is like, what are the implications of this MCC in terms of Chinese policy in Nepal, how does the new government of Prime Minister Deuba look at them and look at China? And interestingly, I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but some of the newspaper reports say that the Belt and Road Initiative issue was not really raised by the government of Nepal. I think the Chinese are obviously quite concerned, with this sort of growing influence and involvement of the US in Nepal.
Right. Thank you, Ranjit. I know Kanak wants to make a point on what you've just said, but I'll come to Kanak a little later. My question is for Nihar Naik, yes. And the question is about Wang Yi. During his visit, signed 9 development projects, sir. MOUs, and again, like in the past, there was no funds earmarked for any project. Not a single BRI project has any funds attached to it. So what do you make of these 9 MOUs, including another feasibility study of the road from Kirung to Kathmandu? Very briefly, Nihar.
Sir, there is 9 agreements. If you'll see, the only one agreement I find that is very game changer. That is basically protocol on sending Chinese medical team to work in Nepal. I think this is the key in the entire 9 agreement. And otherwise, rest of the 8 agreements are just formal agreement, and mostly some of the modifications have been done, like trade and feasibility study, all those things. But the protocol of sending medical team is very important because currently 29 Chinese NGOs are active in Nepal, and 12 Chinese study centers are run, and have been planning to upgrade that to 25 Chinese study centers in Nepal. So they have what they have done, they have diversified their foreign policy from Nepal from state to state relationship to people to people level, and further down to party level. So this is very important, and Government of India needs to be monitor this development very clearly.
Thank you. Thank you for being brief as well as very crisp. Kanak, you wanted to say something on the triangular or the quadrilateral relationship. Kanak
Yeah.
Dikshit?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I essentially agree with what Ambassador Ranjit Ray said earlier, but I'll come to that in half a minute. Firstly, is Nepal a yam between 2 boulders or 3 boulders? I would say it is just a yam, basically, at this present context. What do I mean by that? Nepal cannot hope and should not even try to balance China against India, India against China, and the United States. But Nepal does need the West as the third leg to its stool. So if we were to use a metaphor, let's use the metaphor. We could use the metaphor of a stool. China, India, the north and south, and the rest of the world, particularly the West. Nepal needs to keep independently, bilaterally, fair and transparent relationship with all. It should never certainly try to play one against the other, because that will backfire for sure. And in that context, Nepal should also be able to convince New Delhi and Beijing, we look at you one-on-one. We look at you one-on-one. That will be the success of Nepali diplomacy. For now, as we said earlier, too much of Nepal's foreign policy is muddied by political players and on the ground. And when the political players on the ground have less and less principles than even average politicians, that is where we come into problem. Now, coming to China, Nepal, firstly, let us keep in mind that the Nepal-China relationship is traditionally, you would say it is the Nepal, in the historical sense, Nepal-Tibet mostly. And now that Tibet is part of China, it is, we call it the Nepal-China relationship. However, Nepal and Kathmandu Valley in particular has always had links to the north, economic links, cultural links. So if we go back to developing economic and cultural links to the north, it is in the natural order of things. Before the Young Husband mission of 1902-1903, Nepal's economy was deeply enmeshed with that of Tibet. So we need not get too worried over what will happen now, because it's going to be, that is a historical continuity. Now to come to what General, I have to talk about just one point about Ranjit Ray's point about the gratuitous Chinese position about Nepal. Exactly true, and I'll expand upon it if I have the time.
Right, thank you very much. About Nepal's traditional links up north, as Ramesh Raj Mulmi, both cultural, economic, as he said very vividly in his book. Now, I want to get on to our fifth panelist or semi-panelist, and she is Akanksha Shah. And my question for Akanksha Shah, there you are, is that how does, or rather, how do you see Prime Minister Diopa's very brief visit to New Delhi, and what can be expected in terms of projects and MOUs be expected from this visit, since you've been following Mr. Diopa's visit to India. So very briefly, in what context do you look at Diopa's visit? He was supposed to come up here after the Gujarat Economic Summit. That didn't happen. That was to turn into a bilateral. And now he's finally arrived, coinciding almost with this webinar of ours. Akansha, over to you.
Thank you, General. I'll make it obviously very, very short. Yes, the visit has come up very suddenly, and I think in a much unplanned manner. He will be here from 1st of April to 3rd, as we all know. It's a huge delegation of about 20 to 30 members. I have been told that there are about 4 cabinet ministers as well in the delegation. As far as the agenda is concerned, I think the final agenda has not been pushed through, but largely there will be bilateral talks on connectivity, energy trade, as well as some hydropower projects. Now, specifically, I think the Jayanagar railway section is to be inaugurated. Similarly, the Solu corridor transmission line is expected to be jointly inaugurated by both the prime ministers. I'm not sure, but I'm hoping that the Pancheshwar joint DPR would also be taken up during the talks. There is obviously going to be good conversations on the power trade. Nepal is reeling under certain shortage. But my sources also do tell me that some important issues being faced by the Nepalese people living in India may also come up. That is there. Like I said, we do not have a complete agenda, unfolding as of this minute. But yes, the context in which the Prime Minister's visit is taking place, I think, is very, very significant, as already been stated by almost all the panelists. He faces huge challenges in domestic politics. Like Nihar said, that he has this challenge of managing this present coalition, which not only includes a section of the communist bloc, but also the Madesi force. So most likely, the continuation of the alliance in the coming election could is possibly also going to be in the bilateral talks. But overall, General, I think the most important thing is that although I do not personally expect a lot of breakthrough in this visit, but then if there is a kind of a political will that is generated at both the prime minister's level, then maybe we could see some kind of a breakthrough. Otherwise, it could be taken up as a regular bilateral visit, which almost all the prime ministers of Nepal do to India. One important aspect is also the cultural and the religious part. The Prime Minister Deuba will be visiting Banaras, as you all know, visiting the Vishwanath temple. So there is that cultural aspect too in his visit. Thank you.
Akansha, just to revert to you, very briefly, what do you mean by breakthrough? What do you expect? You mean border dispute, EPG? What are you referring as breakthrough?
That is true. I'm hoping that that Prime Minister Deuba would bring out the border dispute between the two countries and the eminent person group report, which is yet not be accepted by the Indian side. Now, these have been there for quite some time, even during Mr. Oli's time. Now, these are the issues which actually need a breakthrough in the bilateral ties right now. Instead of just basically concentrating on Nepal's relation with China or Nepal's emerging relations with the US, I think we would like to look at how India and Nepal are willing to take our bilateral relations to a next level.
Thank you very much. Well, I am surprised that I find no questions in the chat box from the audience. I therefore urge you, those of you who are watching this program, um, by whichever media you are using, kindly put your questions in the chat box. Can you do that? Now, since Mr. Biswas, do we have any questions?
I'm afraid no, sir.
Yeah, so that gives me an opportunity. To ask one or two additional questions, and let me address this to Amish Mulmi. My first additional question is to Amish Mulmi, and my question is that this is directly related to India-Nepal relations, that after Doklam in 2017 and the confrontation with the PLA in East Ladakh since May 2020, should Nepal not be more sensitive to India's security concerns? In 2017, you will recall the then External Affairs Minister, KB Mahara, Krishna Bahadur Mahara, had said that Nepal is neutral in this matter of Doklam. Your comments, Amish?
Well, I can't speak for Mr. Mehta, but I mean,
No, not on that.
But on the overall, I don't think. I mean, wouldn't you agree that Nepal has addressed India's security concerns well so far? I mean, there is people might politicians are known to say things, but at the end of the day, I suppose it's the actions that count. And if India had any major concerns regarding security, it would have certainly pointed them out, as I mean, it did in the issue of the map, that it said that, or when it noted the constitution, right? So I don't think Nepal is any, let's say, less concerned about India's security concerns on that note, as much as it is. I mean, that is its role, right? Like as a neighbor to assure both of its neighbors of their security concerns in the country, and I think Nepal has so far been doing that pretty well.
Right. Thank you. My next question is to Ambassador Ranjit Ray. Ambassador Ranjit Ray, the question for you is that would you agree that as far as India is concerned at the moment, India is also playing a wait and watch game, as one of our panelists, Kanakmani Dixit, said, that everybody is waiting and watching for the local elections in end of April and the national elections at the end of the year. So for India, like China is also sitting on the fence as far as that is concerned, to see if there can be any Nepali Communist Party unity. So would you then agree that right now most external players are waiting and watching to see what happens?
Well, I don't think India, no, I don't think India can ever afford to wait and watch and play this waiting game in Nepal. I think we have to be very actively engaged with all political players, all parties, and at a much wider grassroots level, because the relationship is really very, very critical for us. I think for India, the India-Nepal relationship is far more critical than the China-Nepal relationship for China, or the US-Nepal relationship for the United States. So India has to be actively engaged. And I think this is the point I've been making constantly. And in fact, if you look at the visit of the Prime Minister Deuba, this is the first visit of a Prime Minister after 4 years. So, COVID or political instability, that's all fine. But these conversations must go on regularly. I mean, every visit doesn't have to be a, big pomp and show and state visit and so on. Has to be regular interactions between our top political leadership, between our ministers, between our parliamentarians, So I don't think India, can afford to play any waiting and watching game. We have to be engaged with everyone. We have to work with whichever government is in power, and we have to be active.
Excellent. No wait and watch for India. India cannot afford to wait and watch. India must be active and proactive as need be. Kanak, there is a question for you from the audience, Mr. Rajiv Ranjan. Question for Kanak Mani Dikshit is that you said that Nepal needs to balance big powers, China, India, and the United States, and to engage on one-to-one basis. But given the nature of international politics, will Nepal be able to douse pressures from these big powers? In other words, will Nepal, as a smaller country, be able to resist pressures from external powers?
I believe so. I very much believe it can. It requires confidence in diplomacy that first and foremost comes from a stable democratic polity. And one of the reasons we are all striving for political stability in democracy within Nepal, firstly, it's meant for the people of Nepal and for our economic development, social development, inclusion. But such a politically stable Nepal also will, even as a relatively small country, it is geopolitically, strategically very importantly placed. So it will be able to manage these relationships. And as I said, it was not a question of balancing each one, but convincing each one that we will not harm your interests, but you do not interfere in ours. And I'll give you one example. Well, I'll give you two examples. To begin with, while I agree with what Ambassador Ranjit Ray said, that every country needs to be proactive in its relationships with the other country and accept the political system in the other country and adjust your own policies accordingly, what Nepal cannot and has shown that it is able to withstand is interventionism. Interventionism of the neighbors or third neighbors or faraway countries. That much Nepal has been able to do, even in its most chaotic situation. Take the blockade, for example, of 2015, or what has just happened vis-a-vis China. Let me come to the ultra, let's call it the micromanagement that India used to conduct on Nepal. India seems to have moved back on that, and that is a good thing because it creates a more stable relationship for the longer term between Nepal and India. Now, let me go into what I had wanted to say earlier about China in relation to this particular question. China seems to have not learned the lessons that India has vis-a-vis the dangers of interventionism or micromanagement in Nepal. And we already went into the topics. The attempts to keep the CPN party together, the failure in keeping it together, which really showed China's failure. And number two, on the MCC, what I call the Chinese debacle. What did the Chinese do? Chinese seems to have a very distanced view on Nepal. And it's really important for Beijing to begin to understand Nepal better so it does not make these faux pas. What is the faux pas that the Chinese did? To begin with, when they come to Nepal, they should be a little more careful about the kind of things they think they can say on Nepali soil. They have to be much more respectful of the Nepali sensibility. For example, Xi Jinping, when he came in October 2019, he gave a very stark warning to the world and to the Nepalis on Nepali soil. He said, anybody who tries to work with China's territorial integrity and sovereignty will be, and the exact words were, will be dealt with crushed bones and shattered bodies. These are the words of the Chinese president to the Nepali formal statement before the Nepali government officials. That would not do. And something is wrong in the way and the word used by Ambassador Ray, gratuitous way in which the Chinese have been dealing. On the MCC, it is seen again in the MCC project where China did, in the beginning, China was very laid back and saying, well, it is there's something for the Nepalis to decide. But once it's seen that it was going to go through with Prime Minister Deva very steadfast on this, and Mr. Oli supporting Mr. Deva in the passage of MCC, the Chinese began to become a little too proactive in what they have to say. They use the term that if you pass MCC, you'll be opening a Pandora's box. They then critique the Americans for using coercive diplomacy in Nepal. And when the foreign minister was in Kathmandu last week, again, according to Chinese media, he made some statements regarding Nepal's own diplomatic agency that he need not have. So I believe that Chinese also should learn more, as New Delhi seems to have, in terms of dealing with Nepal respectfully and on one-on-one, realizing that Nepal itself cannot and will not go against either Indian interest or Chinese interest. And the last point about Nepal-India is just that there are lots of issues, and those were issues of the day. They were normal enough between two countries, but the one issue, the Limpia-Dura border dispute, is something Nepal and India must seriously tackle. It cannot be wished away. It is there, and it has got to be tackled.
Okay, that's very, very good. There's one last question we can take, and this question is from Malika Shakya. Malika Shakya, South Asian University. She's a Nepali with that name, and her question is, and I will give this question to Nihar Nayak. I would like to know from the panelists, if the changed global strategic situation following the Ukraine-Russian crisis has changed anything in terms of how MCC is perceived and what it means for the trilateral relationship between Nepal, India, and China. Yeah, Nihar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Look, sir, a very straight answer on this one is the trilateral relationship is going to happen, because this proposal of trilateral or 2+1 proposal has been floated since 2012 indirectly from Chinese side. Then Pushpakamal Dahal Prachanda, he also made several times on this. So government of India has declined and refused to take up this proposal many times. Number one, this is very clear. Number two, we have to see whether the MCC or the BRI, I believe here that it is not going to be very effective or impactful in the Himalayan region. Number one, why? Because most of the extra-regional powers, they have exhausted their power related to the Himalayan region. Number one, US, maximum they can done by the putting up a MCC. China, maximum they have exhausted their options. Number one, they have exhausted their soft power. They have exhausted their diplomatic tools. Now they are in a coercive action, basically blocking the China-Nepal trading points. So I don't believe that the only option for China option left is only because of the only kind of confrontational option is left for that. So I don't think any trilateral thing is going to happen, and MCC and BRI impact is going to be negligible. The last point I want to say that number one is that India is now, the MCC era or BRI is over. It's time for India, because India is the final decision maker in this subcontinent. So whatever India, unless any kind of program or project is coming to the southern region, if India is not compliant, that India may directly or indirectly at a certain point of time will have ability to neutralize that program in the entire subcontinent. So that is one thing. And in terms of the related to this boulder kind of concept 2 or 3 boulder, I think this Nepal is a part of one boulder. India is the final decision maker in this region. So this whether MCC or BRI, they will just come and go, but India is the original main actor, will continue in the Himalayan region.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, just 1 second. Sorry, we are out. Issue, Kanak, only 30 seconds.
Yes, I think we are living in a different planet if we think that India is the final decision maker in the subcontinent, which includes more than one country, more than two countries. There are 7 countries if you don't count Afghanistan. So my 30 seconds is up, but there's no way that in this new world where there are sovereign states, whether we like it or not, that India will be the final decision maker ipso facto.
Right. I think, as they say, if Kanak Mani Dikshit has said something, he has said something. So on that very final note of finality, we have to bring this program to an end. But let me add one thing, that India may not be the final voice or the final word, but in this, whatever triangular or quadrilateral relationship, India enjoys the supreme advantage of geography. And although Nepal can turn north, it can turn northeast, but it will always gaze south because of the geography and the proximity. But India must also learn the lesson that has emerged from this panel discussion: respect for Nepal and respect for all the countries in the region. And I think that formula is succeeding, as we can see, the manner in which India has been able to reoccupy and regain some of the strategic space it had lost to China and Sri Lanka. And this is happening in a number of other places. But India-Nepal relations, bilateral relations, are eternal. And the visit of Prime Minister Sher Bahadur Deopa proves this. All that is left for me to say is thank you to my panelists, thank you to the audience, and till next time, which is on 29th of April, we will come up with another country in the series of India's Neighbourhood First. So till then, goodbye, namaskar, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.